Hello, everyone. My name is Sam Carter. I had just recently started a ministry called Faith Rewind Outreach, which you may have heard on the YouTube video with Tim Barber and myself. And nothing is on there currently, but I'm planning to add some things just to invite people on my journey to learn more about reconnecting to the roots of faith and my own personal attempt to do that. And I know many have, but each of us needs to have our own journey, and it would just be a way for me of sharing my thoughts as I come across them. So this is a follow-up video to what I had done previously with Tim Barber when we talked about the acrostic Snapdragon that I came up with through the help of Perplexity AI. And we went through the 10 different ways of talking about 7 of the ancient atonement models that were in the first millennium. So that was last time when we looked at it to tell us that succinct way to introduce the ancient Christian atonement models. But today we are going to draw contrast between these ways of ordering the biblical data with other more modern atonement models. And this may end up being a discussion that I have with Tim, but I thought I would just do it as a recording to get all the thoughts out there. This can end up being quite long. So, and with the addition of discussions that Tim and I would have, it might end up being 2 different parts to this follow-up, so 3 parts in total. But yeah, so why does this matter? I would say modern society needs to look at the scriptural data for atonement again. It has all the right dots, but wrong in sometimes unhelpful ways to connect the dots, and the ordering of concepts matters. So it needs to align with the early Christians instead of much later Christians. So I went through all the ante-Nicene Christian quotes that we have on atonement in the book A Dictionary of Early Christian Beliefs here, and Recapitulation won completely and totally. It was just a landslide victory for representation among early church fathers, the early church writers. And you can see in here I had written, like restored icon is one that I wrote here. That's the other side of recapitulation. And I wrote all these notes in here to recognize what atonement models I saw as I was going through them. You will not find any that became prominent in the second millennium. But I would say, and I'm not of this persuasion currently myself, but the Orthodox Church basically has I would say, a near perfect representation of the ancient views that were expressed of atonement. So after that, I continued to kind of work through these thoughts. But yes, the rest of the Snapdragon points were there too, besides just the recapitulation one. I think also, apart from that, why do we need to look at the data again, the scriptural data for atonement? We've created unnecessary complications or deeply problematic implications. For example, if the type of payment that Jesus makes is a rescue or ransom, and we imply that the Father was the one being paid by Jesus' death specifically, then what does this say about the Father? He would be the captor of mankind unto sin and death. And I think there is a greater function than this in the process that doesn't raise these suspicious questions about God the Father. We should have an uncomplicated view of the goodness of the Father. And modern expressions of atonement kind of wrongly complicate this, in my opinion. And then a third point of why we should look at it again is some expressions of atonement are damaging for those with family trauma. We'll get more into this later, but in some of the expressions I've heard, if someone had a father who could only subside his anger through meting out severe punishment, even if it landed on the innocent, the emotional scars left by this experience don't comport well with some representations of atonement that paint it similarly. So just imagine a father lining up his kids to give severe punishment to one of his kids that crashed the family's Ferrari Enzo into the house. The father says, somebody needs to be punished with this, 40 lashes. And one kid admits that they are innocent, but they will take the punishment. So this child, in this case representing Jesus, kind of obviously, would be rightly viewed as loving, but the father would be viewed as cruel and even unjust. This is a right intuition in this scenario that leads one to a complicated relationship with the father at best, or to just outright leave him at worst. So we really don't want that, and there's certainly atonement models that can start to paint things that way or lead in that direction for people when they begin to learn it that way. You'll notice that in the Snapdragon acrostic, there are three intentionally missing models of atonement from it that arrange the data differently. And again, I said that they kind of came from the second millennium interpretations and concerns. So, what do they correctly assume, or what do they incorrectly assume? So you first of all have, and these are all what I would call satisfaction theories. And maybe it'll be obvious as we talk through them why it's called that way. So the first one is called Anselm's satisfaction. This was formulated right after the Orthodox Catholic split in 1054. It was about 1100 where this character Anselm came into play, and he assumes that God has his honor taken away from him by sin, that Christ's death needs to occur for the sake of restoring God's lost honor. I don't think there's really a sense that we can argue concretely that God the Father had his honor lost or something like that. I may not be articulating this in the best way. I have to be honest. I don't know a whole lot of the Catholic ways of explaining this one. Unlike some others we will go through that I am quite familiar with. This one I know that I need to dive into more and make sure that I'm articulating correctly, but that's my perception of it. And it seems to be an assumption that they make. Now, this second one is what we will probably spend a lot of time on, which is what I would call penal substitutionary atonement, aka PSA. So there's quite a lot of things here, and I would say this first was articulated by Martin Luther. While I am glad that he, broke away from the Catholic Church, I'm not a Catholic. I'm not a fan of the Catholic ways of doing things. I think he had some very big problems also in the way that he lived and the things that he did, but doctrinally as well. So it assumes, number one, that justice must always ultimately require retribution, or kind of the tit for tat or lex talionis type of justice. And Jesus spoke against lex talionis, which maybe means that you should think twice about this. And it assumes that every sin must be punished by God to a person specifically, even if the innocent is killed in the process. We know God as a vindicator rather than a punisher of the innocent. That's just a theme that we understand very concretely about God the Father. Number two, it assumes that God's wrath must be satisfied specifically by meting out full punishment on Jesus. Rather, we know that full wrath and punishment occurs when the devil and his angels are banished to the lake of fire, along with sin itself that went down to Sheol. We talked about that in the last video when we were talking with Tim. So in assumption number three, it assumes that Jesus suffered the same punishment that we were due for our sin, but Jesus did not suffer in torment of hell or the lake of fire. That's pretty obvious that he didn't. So I don't know why these claims are made in the penal substitutionary atonement model. And we will get into articulating that in a little while, of what is actually PSA. There is the third satisfaction model, which I would say came primarily from Grotius and John Wesley. They are big proponents of the governmental theory or moral government theory of atonement, and that assumes that the optics of righteousness and a moral government are a very large part of what is important. So they might say something like Jesus bore a punishment, but not the full punishment that we deserved, and it was to demonstrate divine justice. So going off the cuff here a little bit, when I spoke about this a while ago, there was a king, I think he was in Greece, named Zaleucus, and he made a demonstration of something like this where the law was if you committed adultery, then you have to have your eyes gouged out, both of them. So his son actually was found committing adultery, and he needed to be able to show that he was very serious about this, and that he had to carry out a sentence that was, at least the equivalent of what he had said. So he gouged out one of his son's eyes, but kept the other one because he didn't want his son to go blind. And then he gouged one of his own eyes out, and that added up to the same amount of punishment that was there, but it was a little different. So I might compare the governmental theory to something like that. But God is able to demonstrate justice while not carrying out the exact sentence. I am wondering if maybe there are some ways, if you're being a little complicated in the way you explain it, maybe you could get by with something like this. But I do wonder about it. I think it shares a lot of the same assumptions and unfair and unjust implications of the penal substitution model. But so I need to be sure, though, that when we're talking about this, I don't want to turn off people who are already familiar with PSA. So let's make some concessions that we'll gladly make for the PSA advocates. So Jesus died for us. Amen. He suffered for us. He bore our sin. He took a punishment at the hands of lawless men, so we wouldn't be punished as enemies of God. We know that God the Father authorized and decreed Jesus to be crushed for us. God had justice in mind when Jesus went to the cross. Jesus' righteousness is substituted to us by the gospel inaugurated with his death, burial, and resurrection, which we partake of to receive it. And Jesus' death was a replacement for us being punished with death. All those are things that I would gladly say. You can go back and rewind that and listen to that. Those are things that, as a non-PSA person, I can still affirm. I think people that are PSA would say that they uniquely hold those claims. No, that's not true. It's the ordering of those concepts and the extra implications that they throw on top of that, which I would say that formulates their system. So then another concession we would make is there is at least one sense you could make a case that Jesus received the wrath of God, and that would be in the Romans 1 sense, where the wrath of God has been revealed against all ungodliness, and God gave them up to that ungodliness. In that sense, in the chapter, it is their own sins, but one could say that God gave Jesus up to Satan to be shamefully treated by the ungodly. This is not a punishment or smiting, but a willful withdrawal of protection from the evil one, which Jesus did suffer from that willingly. So it would be fine to say that Jesus died as a replacement for us being punished to death by God if we stuck to that wording, because it doesn't presume that punishment is substituted, but death is substituted, and it is true that in our case it would be punishment if we died. In Jesus' case, it could be left unanswered whether he received a punishment by God or not. And I would hope that someone who is maybe not being very dogmatic could at least leave that up to interpretation while still keeping the concessions that we talked about. And this is part of the reason I prefer the term replacement over substitution. Substitution seems to imply a similar function, whereas replacement seems to mean that the issue was taken care of whether using the same function or not. And the issue of sin was taken care of. Justice happened. The Father did all these things with atonement that took care of it, but maybe it wasn't through the same function as the retribution that it would have been in our case if we were punished with death. Right? So there's some other ways to think about this, going back to Snapdragon and the 7 models of atonement from the ancient world. So let's go to a hopefully fair articulation of PSA in 3 different tiers, plus governmental theory revisiting that. So what actually is PSA? We will now attempt to articulate that. In general, I would say there's 3 parts to it. So number 1, Jesus Christ voluntarily took the punishment for humanity's sins, acting as a substitute. Okay. The penalty for sin, part 2, the penalty for sin is death, with which Christ bore on behalf of sinners. Okay. This is where I think it really starts to not sound right. This substitution satisfies the Father's requirement for justice via retribution, allowing for quote-unquote forgiveness, which I would say that's not actually what forgiveness means. This is the problematic part, because it frames the Father as needing this death paid out to him in order to forgive. So our main problem as humanity in this view is the Father. He becomes the main problem that we have to work around. And then going to governmental theory, again, this is similar to PSA, but it states that Jesus took on just part of the punishment, or a punishment by God, in lieu of the punishment that we deserved. This is like when the law gives a reduced sentence based on the circumstances, but still considers justice upheld. Again, we reference Zaleucus for that. So let's go into some different levels of PSA. And I would say level 1 being mild and not too bad. This was actually an AI-generated response, by the way. I'm trying to use these tools to help me to hopefully be fair in articulating this, because I want to be fair to our PSA friends. And definitely reach out with that olive branch and say we want peace, but we want to understand each other well. And there are different ways of talking about this. Not everyone falls into one bucket when they're talking about PSA. So level 1, the mild level, claims In a mild view of penal substitutionary atonement, the focus is on God's justice being satisfied through Jesus' sacrifice without emphasizing wrath or punishment. Again, it might actually include wrath or punishment, but doesn't emphasize that. This perspective sees Christ's death as a necessary means to uphold divine justice, allowing God to forgive sins while maintaining holiness. It emphasizes the love and grace of God in providing a way for reconciliation, highlighting the voluntary nature of Christ's sacrifice as an act of love rather than divine retribution. I would say this is mostly fine with all the words that were said, but it's arguably uncommon among PSA advocates. But I would still just not say that really wrath or punishment is at all the focus. It's just not being emphasized in this mild view of it. And I would say a lot of people land here if they're not digging into PSA. They usually land about here in mild PSA because they're picking it up from their church environment or whatever. So a thought that I have about this is maybe one could say Jesus took on responsibility for our sins to deal with them through his death sentence as decreed by the Father, substituting our punishment with his death, but without directly still saying God punished Jesus or God killed Jesus, implying accountability. In other words, it could be said Jesus tasted death for us, but for multiple possible reasons as a substitute for our being punished. But would this still be PSA? I'm not sure if that still lands you in PSA proper, if we were to say those things. So let's go to level 2, which is the moderate level PSA. And I'd say people who are studying in it usually land here, and it is problematic, in my opinion. So a moderate stance on penal substitutionary atonement holds that God's wrath against sin necessitates punishment, which Jesus willingly takes upon himself. This view underscores the legal and forensic aspects of atonement, where Christ's death satisfies the demands of justice, allowing believers to be declared righteous. It balances the themes of justice, think retribution though, and mercy, portraying Jesus as a substitute who endures the penalty of sin, thus reconciling humanity with God. Again, this is assuming from the PSA view that all justice boils down to retribution rather than restitution. That is a focus of Hebrew justice, and you can look at the Bible Project where I think they articulate that quite well. That is the justice that we need to have in mind, and this just lumps it all in the wrong category. I think retribution was a concession given to mankind for when restitution is not possible. And there are definitely times and places for retribution, but it's not the be-all, end-all of justice like I think most PSA advocates would argue something like that. We've talked about in this one forensic aspects of atonement. I think that is, if you look at the early church writers and Jewish background, the whole forensic focus, it shows up a lot in especially Calvinist circles and Baptists in the way that they talk about it. I came out of a Baptist background. I don't have plans to go back to that, but they do seem to articulate atonement in a lot of forensic ways, and that's just, no. Biblically, there's almost next to nothing to say about salvation and atonement being in the forensic category. It's much more an ontological change that happens within a person through the working of Christ, and there's much more to say about it from that theme, and this just kind of shifts the focus away from that to the forensics, making it like it's all balancing a ledger. We'll get to that a little bit later. Then we have level 3, which is the extreme, I would say high-level Calvinism professes the extreme type of PSA. So an extreme view of penal substitutionary atonement emphasizes the intensity of God's wrath and the necessity of punishment for sin, portraying Jesus' suffering as a direct appeasement of divine anger. This perspective can be shocking as it presents the atonement as a transaction where God's justice is satisfied through violent retribution, with Christ enduring the full extent of divine punishment. Critics of this view argue that it risks portraying God as vengeful and undermines the relational and restorative aspects of the gospel. That last sentence, yes, I would say that is me as a critic. I would say those things. I read a book by the Calvinist J.D. Greer recently. It's called The Gospel, and it had a subtitle underneath it I can't remember. But in that book, he articulates that Jesus was a quote-unquote lightning rod for God's wrath and anger. So this level of PSA is just barely different than making the Father out to be like an angry Aztec volcano god requiring an innocent sacrifice. I think this is just going way too far. I am just noticeably frustrated with the high-level Calvinists that are out there. I think they're doing an absolutely terrible job with representing God in all kinds of ways, and I would say J.D. Greer really messed it up with that explanation of PSA that he did. I'm sure he has other good work that he does, but man, I did not like that at all, how he articulated that, and I think we need to steer clear of that and never talk that way, ever. We need to show God for who he is, and there are ways to talk about divine justice that he has that don't go to this level of painting him in such a bad, bad light. So concluding thoughts on all this, I would say PSA is more likely to be mild or tame if it is introduced at the end of studying all other atonement models, as we went through the Snapdragon acrostic. I would introduce that as a first introduction to atonement because it came first in the Christian record. So I would say prioritize that first. These are how the first Christians talked about it. The problem, though, with PSA is that people today are taught it first and foremost, which makes it easier to develop these more extreme views of it. They think of it as if it were like the central hub of a wheel, talking about all the different models of atonement. No, if we look at, again, the ancient quotes that we have, it seems like recapitulation actually won out, and there are other great ones that we can more relate to in our modern Western world. Recapitulation can be a little bit hard to relate at first to that way of talking about it. Christus Victor is one. N.T. Wright will talk a good deal about that one. Being a very, very, very smart Westerner, he is incredibly intelligent. But yeah, if you have PSA as your central hub view and put it first and foremost, you're going to probably end up with some more extreme views of it than you should have. It's just, yeah, not by a long shot. It was not articulated in that ordering of concepts until Martin Luther, I would say, and I've read some books about him critiquing Martin Luther. David Berceau has a few like that, and it led to me understanding that I think he was actually the first to articulate PSA. The PSA advocates will try to kind of cherry pick in the past. I think if you look around the quotes that they're saying, no, there are no past early church writers that were saying PSA. If you expand the quotes, if you just cherry pick, you will be able to make it say anything you want, just like how the Calvinists do with their proof texting. Just like anybody who's in false doctrine will be able to promote their false doctrine through cherry picking. So let's go to caricatures versus consequences of PSA. So before we're accused of straw manning, we need to know that there are caricatures of this out there that really do go too far in representing PSA in a wrong light. I would say if somebody like myself, who is a critic, were to say these things, that's going too far. You're not being fair. So number one is that God is a cosmic child abuser. I've heard that one. I may have used it once myself, and I'm just going to withdraw from that. So that might be somewhat close when comparing to an extremist and high-level Calvinist take on PSA, but for your run-of-the-mill PSA person, no. Those are rare views and do not reflect even the moderate PSA advocates. I would not say cosmic child abuser. People could say, as a caricature of PSA, that it's an endorsement of violence, saying that PSA opens the doors for violent punishment by Christians and retribution becoming the only means of societal justice. No, PSA advocates completely understand, for the most part, for like 99.9%, I'm imagining, that there are other ways to do justice in society that don't require full meting out of punishment. Rehabilitation and things like that are absolutely essential in our justice system. That is a better way to approach justice, if we can, I would say, than to always try to mete it out via, tit for tat style justice, which is, again, lex talionis. Jesus spoke out against that. Why would we use this as a foundational model of justice in the way we talk about atonement? PSA is just being a little ridiculous about that, in my opinion. But what other false caricatures are there? You might be a PSA person watching this, and I've said some things. Maybe I went a little too far with some things, but I really am just saying, here's my thoughts. But please tell me, what other false caricatures have you heard out there? That goes from both sides. We want to be fair. We want to try to steelman our opponents. And I've heard Leighton Flowers say that a number of times. He's a very nice gentleman. I don't know why Calvinists seem to point him as if he's not. He is very, very kind. And just basically everything he's been saying and the way he's been reaching out to Calvinists. But just echoing that sentiment is how can we steel man our opponents here? I want to make sure I'm doing that. And I do have dear friends, dear friends that hold to this position. I'm a little sad by it, and I feel like after this video, maybe I can share this with them and show them why I'm pushing back on some of these things in love, because I want them to have the best view of God possible that just glorifies Him to the utmost degree, without confusion, without complication, which PSA creates confusion, creates complication. So let's go to consequences, though, or entailments of the philosophy of PSA. So I would say that it does actually have a Nestorian philosophy, which is a heresy that was proclaimed as such in one of the councils. I believe that was the third. Yes, I think that's right. The third council that was had. In my view, I don't prioritize church councils for saying what is and isn't biblical, but I do think that for the most part they did a good job of pointing out what is right and wrong about when talking about theology and Christology. When it gets to some of the later ones, I think they talk about like iconoclasm and stuff like that. I would tend to agree with the iconoclasts for the most part right now, but I'm willing to hear what those advocates have to say on those topics. So back to this though, the Nestorian philosophy. So it's similar to that because PSA creates a disunity between Christ's divinity and his humanity on the cross, so that he could be condemned by God as a human, but simultaneously vindicated as divine. Alternatively, you have the divine punishing the divine, the Father punishing the Son, which is disunity in the Godhead itself. That hopefully should be obvious, but that's a problem. You can't avoid talking about that, and you have to address that problem if you're a PSA advocate. You can't just sweep it under the rug. And to that first point, people often say Jesus was admitting separation from the Father when he quotes Psalm 22 on the cross, but you have to read the rest of the psalm to know how that's not the case. David is saying that God never really left him, and so and quoting the first line of a psalm, by the way, is the same at that time as bringing to mind the entire psalm before there were chapter numbers. You wouldn't just say Psalm 22, you would say the first line of it, and then a Jewish mind would be like, oh yeah, that psalm, and then they would recall the rest of it. It's a shorthand. So when Jesus is saying, my God, why have you forsaken me? He's not saying, God, you have forsaken me. He is bringing to mind the rest of that psalm. I think you'll find many scholars that agree with what I just said about that. Please don't think that Jesus is saying, God, you have left me. I think Jesus is smart enough to know in this situation what's going on, and so why would he be asking the question to begin with? It's quoting a psalm. So another consequence or entailment is the consequence of transactional legalism. So the idea that justice is ultimately balancing a ledger of sin committed to punishment meted out on a person. I'm reading my notes here. I'm trying to make sure I'm saying that right with the right inflection. The consequence of transactional legalism, which is that justice is ultimately balancing a ledger of sins committed, balancing that, to punishment meted out on a person. So this is against the Hebrew concept of justice, as we spoke of before, which is actually the idea of putting things back into right order. That's what the word restitution means, is putting things back into right order or right relationship. So again, see the Bible Project video about justice for examples of this. It's a very helpful video. Retribution serves as a concession to that, as we said before. People often say that this is what Colossians 2:14 argues, though. But the record of debt that was nailed to the cross in that verse is slave debt from sin, which is keeping us in bondage to sin, the slave master of sin. It's not a death debt that we owe God. It's a slave debt that we owe to sin, keeping us in bondage. So look again at Romans 6:23 as a contrast between two masters and what they pay out. This helps with that concept in Colossians 2:14. So death isn't a debt. Death is a wage paid by the old master of sin. We owe God rather a righteousness debt instead, which Jesus pays, and we actually pay along with him as his body. We talked about this back in the video going through SNAPDRAGON. By transferring masters, the Lord holds back the wages of the old master of sin and gives the free gift of eternal life simply for belonging to him. So let's just look at that a little bit. Yeah, the righteousness debt. I think we mentioned in the previous video that since creation, our job was to image God in the flesh. And because we sinned, it is missing that mark. That was our job, the mark. We missed that mark. So we are not able to pay God with our lives what we owe him because he was our creator. And that was our job, was to, as a created being in his image, to image him perfectly. But Jesus came in human flesh, and he fulfilled the purpose of what humanity was supposed to do from the beginning. So Adam failed, and he brought shame upon the human race. And then Jesus, being the second Adam, came and he fulfilled that and did everything right that Adam did wrong. That is the recapitulation model. That is also restored icon, which is part of that recapitulation model of atonement. And going to Snapdragon, we call that adamant restoration, right? And it's even got the pun there of Adam, because it deals so much with Adam, and the first Adam, like we just said, failing where Jesus succeeded. So finally, last part of this, just another consequence is that this negates true forgiveness, which is to cancel a penalty rather than demand it, right? Forgiveness is not forcing a payment to be fulfilled by another party. That's not what forgiveness means. When we're talking about debt forgiveness, in the political culture of today, we're not talking about somebody has to jump in and write out a check and then pay it. It's saying those debts are canceled. Now, yes, in that scenario, we know that there are long-term effects of that just reverberate into the economy, but the part about cancellation is still very true. So also another consequence of this is that we become what we worship. So a consequence of PSA, would we want to become exacting of vengeance like God is in this view? Would this be good of us if we were to be exacting of vengeance that we need when we are wronged? If it's not good of us, then why do we say it's good for God to do that? That's maybe more of a challenge than a like total gotcha. But why is it good for God to exact every bit of vengeance possible? He's not withholding any vengeance. It's all meted out somewhere, and that all collectively piles on Jesus in this view, it seems. I don't think that's what forgiveness really is, and I think that we will start to become more like that mindset, possibly. And not as a for sure thing, but we might start to become more like that as we worship a God that we picture like that. So I'm just going to list these, and you can go and look these up later. But it contradicts several passages. This is probably the part that you need to focus on the most, but go and do your own reading. I'm not going to jump into these right now. Go read Ezekiel 18. Read Proverbs 17, verse 15. Read Isaiah 5, verses 20 through 23. Go read the unmerciful servant parable. It goes against the theme of that. It goes against the idea of forgive as God in Christ forgave you. Really, because if he forgave me through retribution, then I have to forgive through retribution. That's not right. I do not forgive through retribution. I forgive completely freely. And it goes against passages that are against humans harboring wrath for one another, because it makes it seem like wrath is just a fundamental expression of God. So now we're going to go into another consequence, which is that it contradicts Justin Martyr's dialogue with Trypho, who was a Jew, I think a Hellenistic Jew, if I'm not mistaken. And this quote sounds, humorously to me, it sounds similar to a very heated Facebook post. So here's the quote, and I'm not saying, by the way, that Justin Martyr is canonical like Scripture, but he is a very, very helpful resource for us to see ancient insights into subjects like atonement and biblical views that were common in that very, very, very early part of Christianity in the 2nd century. So here's the quote. But you were never shown to be possessed of friendship or love either towards God or towards the prophets or towards yourselves, but, as is evident, you are ever found to be idolaters and murderers of righteous men, so that you laid hands even on Christ himself, and to this very day you abide in your wickedness, execrating those who prove that this man who is crucified by you is the Christ. Nay, more than this, and here's the important part, you suppose that he was crucified as hostile to and cursed by God, which supposition is the product of your most irrational mind. End of the important part. For though you have the means of understanding that this man is Christ from the signs given by Moses, yet you will not, but in addition, fancying that we can have no arguments, you put whatever question comes into your minds, while you yourselves are at a loss for arguments whenever you meet with some firmly established Christian. End quote. So that's a bit of the insight into what he had to say. He was saying that this foundational concept that we find in PSA. He's arguing against with this guy named Trypho, and he says it's the product of a most irrational mind. I'm not going to say that to my PSA friends, but that would be seemingly Justin Martyr having a similar gripe. So final entailment that I have listed here is that it forces the idea that God must be acted upon in order to forgive, instead of forgiving freely or even with repentance. So most PSA advocates argue for impassibility, which is a complete contradiction in terms if that is the case. You cannot hold that and PSA at the same time. That means that a PSA advocate would need to borrow from open theism, but open theism already, as a theme, supports a more flexible and relational nature of God that does not comport very well with PSA. So that puts you in a really hard spot. And to say that God must be acted upon in order to forgive. No, that's not forgiving freely. So what other entailments are there that aren't caricatures? Do you have any more? You can certainly submit them to me, and I would like to go through them. I will make a plug for this, but just today I got this book from Kevin George called Atonement and Reconciliation. I have not read any of it yet, but I looked at the table of contents and it looks very good. I don't judge a book by a cover, but sometimes I judge it a little bit by its table of contents, and it looks like it's very promising. A search for the original meaning contrasted with penal substitutionary atonement. It looks like he did a fantastic job with this, so I will enjoy reading through that. And it's not as if I haven't had a very fair exposure to PSA, by the way. I would say I've had the equivalent of exposure, about 5 or 6 books of that length, in just being exposed to PSA growing up. This is kind of a newer thing for me as of the last 2 years, seeing all the many critiques of it out there. But that seems to be good. I think I will enjoy that. So let's go through what objections do we anticipate and how do we address them. So number one, Jesus was a willing participant in receiving God's punishment. You might hear an objection like that. I will just say, how does this change the implications for the Father? It can't. I don't understand how this is an objection, just pointing out the willingness of Jesus. Going back to our example of like a father lining up his children and somebody's going to get 40 lashes for crashing a Ferrari Enzo into a building, into the house, the father still is going to be viewed at in a bad light if he punishes his child, if that child is willing but is not guilty. So it doesn't really remove any concerns as far as I can tell. It's strange that that's used as an objection. One that I have heard personally not too long ago is that court systems routinely punish a corporation for the acts of an individual employee. This apparently came about, or was mentioned in a William Lane Craig video, and he is very intelligent for sure. He is, for a greater part of his atonement understanding, I'd say he is a PSA advocate, unfortunately, but he did use this one, and when I looked at underneath the video, there were people who work in legal that were basically just raking him over the coals on this one and saying, what are you talking about? That's not how it works in the justice system. So the reality is the employee is still punished in these law systems, and the corporation is usually charged on the grounds of some negligence if they're charged at all, which they may not be. There's some variance to this, but the idea that it's just of known fact that like corporations get the punishment and the employee doesn't, there would have to be some extenuating circumstances for that to happen that way. So another one, this is common as an objection that we hear from our PSA friends, is 2 Corinthians 5:21 says that Jesus became sin, and Galatians 3:13 says he became a curse for us. So after looking into this, no, the nuances are different from how they're presenting it. Jesus becoming sin either has to do with his bearing of sin as a high priest or scapegoat, or it deals with him bearing the curse of Adam as shown in Romans 8:3 to condemn sin in his flesh, also possibly becoming a sin offering. And if you go back to Leviticus, that doesn't mean the same things that it does according to the way that PSA advocates talk about those offerings. Again, maybe I haven't articulated this point, but I think they just don't do a very good job talking about how sacrifices worked in the Old Testament. No, we could definitely have some others come in here, like I think Spencer Owen is someone that I've talked to quite a bit about this, and he articulates very well what was going on in the atonement. There's another guy named Phil Bray, who has the YouTube channel Leviticus is Fun, and definitely go watch that, and he does make it fun with some dry, awkward humor in some short videos that he does. And he would articulate as well where the PSA advocates are getting this wrong about what Leviticus offerings were. They're not transactional, they're gifts to God, they're relational things. Yeah, it's not how they present it. So a little bit off the cuff there. I actually got a little bit lost here. So yes, Jesus becoming a curse for us is not the same as being accursed. The word is not anathema here, but katara, which is to be spoken of shamefully, is what that means. Spoken of shamefully versus accursed. And 1 Corinthians 12 verse 3 says, no one in the spirit can ever say Jesus is accursed. So another objection we might hear is, what about places that talk about the cup of God's wrath poured out by God and Jesus takes that cup? I will admit, I need to visit this one more. There's lots of nuance here, and again, I would suggest Spencer Owen for this one. I remember he had some good things to say, but I think it was quite the road to go down to understand this one. And I would defer to his expertise in talking on this point a little bit more. But it just does not always mean, when this is being talked about, the cup of God's wrath, doesn't always mean that the end of God's cup of wrath is to exact a punishment. And in some Old Testament scriptures, the cup actually passes from one party to another, even from innocent to guilty. There's nothing at all suggesting that the cup Jesus takes is a meting out of God's punishment onto him, so it's just an exhausting of wrath for punishment. No, that's not a unanimous use for it. Jesus even said, you will drink my cup, to some of his apostles. And if this is meant to be God's wrath as a punishment for sin, then PSA falls apart just from that. Yeah, I just don't think this is a good argument, but there are other ways to talk about this that I would leave to some others more better prepared to talk about it. So another point that we might hear from our PSA friends is, what about some early church writer quotes that sound like they're saying Jesus dies literally in our place? This is one that I've heard. We talked about this a little bit before, but just to reiterate, if you read the rest of their writings, this still fits the recapitulation model idea that he died as a human. That's what it would mean, in our place. He didn't die in the flesh so we don't have to. That's not the idea. That would be a substitutionary death. There were still plenty of Christian martyrs, and even some that were crucified just as Jesus was. We are all called to participate in his death as well, according to Romans 6 and elsewhere. The early church writers do not combine in one thought all the elements that Jesus died by the Father's demand for retributive justice in our place as a punishment by the Father so that we don't have to be punished. Like, when you say all those things together, that's formulating PSA in a nutshell. But that articulation did not exist until ancient Christianity was long over. Again, probably Martin Luther. And then someone in PSA might say God's justice can't be served without PSA. And I would just say again, God's justice has everything to do with restitution. That's restoring the right order and right relationship with things. And it's not always retribution. Retribution should be seen as a concession for when restitution is not possible otherwise. the justice of God seen in his plan that was already articulated in ancient atonement models or under the SNAPDRAGON acrostic. So that articulates the justice of God better, I think, in the SNAPDRAGON acrostic. He's restoring things to the way they ought to be that way. So a flagship text for PSA is usually Isaiah 53. And I would say, let's go right ahead and read that and go to the traditional stopping place when we talk about Jesus. My apologies for this little short break here while I am opening my Bible, which I did not smartly do beforehand. All right, Isaiah 53, let's read. Who has believed what he has heard from us, and to whom has the arm of the Lord been revealed? For he grew up before him like a young plant, and like a root out of dry ground. He had no form or majesty that we should look at him, and no beauty that we should desire him. Verse 3, he was despised and rejected by men, a man of sorrows and acquainted with grief, and as one from whom men hide their faces, he was despised, and we esteemed him not. Verse 4, surely he has borne our griefs and carried our sorrows, yet we esteemed him stricken, smitten by God, and afflicted. Verse 5, but he was wounded for our transgressions, he was crushed for our iniquities. Upon him was the chastisement that brought us peace, and with his stripes we are healed. All we like sheep have gone astray, we have turned every one to his own way, and the Lord has laid on him the iniquity of us all. He was oppressed, and he was afflicted, yet he opened not his mouth. Like a lamb that is led to the slaughter, and like a sheep that before its shearers is silent, so he opened not his mouth. By oppression and judgment he was taken away. And as for his generation, who considered that he was cut off out of the land of the living, stricken for the transgression of my people? And they made his grave with the wicked, and with a rich man in his death, although he had done no violence, and there was no deceit in his mouth. Yet it was the will of the Lord to crush him. He has put him to grief. When his soul makes an offering for guilt, he shall see his offspring, he shall prolong his days. The will of the Lord shall prosper in his hand. Out of the anguish of his soul he shall see and be satisfied. By his knowledge shall the righteous one, my servant, make many to be accounted righteous, and he shall bear their iniquities. Therefore I will divide him a portion with the many, and he shall divide the spoil with the strong, because he poured out his soul to death, and was numbered with the transgressors. Yet he bore the sin of many, and makes intercession for the transgressors. I really need to do a deeper dive into this one. There is a lot to say here, but let's just hit on a few things here. In verse 3, it says that he was rejected by men. It does not say he was rejected by God. Not that a PSA person always articulates it that way. We're just hitting some things that we might commonly hear. Verse 4, we esteemed him stricken, smitten by God, but that's not saying that he actually was. And this is kind of like Girard's scapegoat theory in a way that we talked about in the previous video. That we esteemed him this way. It may have been similar to a scapegoating mechanism there. And how does Matthew 8 render this? He talks about bearing our diseases as healing our diseases. I think that fits the new creation part of our acrostic earlier better. So verse 5, all this that it says there is true, but who dealt this out? And I think the clue is in verse 8, which is that it was an injustice that he was taken away, not a justice. We're not talking about God's justice via retribution here. We're saying it was an injustice of Jesus to be carried away by the hands of lawless men. That was a necessary device for atonement, according to what we've already established. So that goes well with the new covenant part of our acrostic. So verse 6, this motif that we see here comes straight from the high priest and scapegoat. Again, we have a scapegoat part of our acrostic. Verse 7, it says, like a sheep before its shearers is silent. That is the Passover lamb part of our acrostic. Verse 8, again, it was an injustice that he was taken away, not a justice. Let's just be sure about that. Verse 10, it says, the will of the Lord was to crush him. This is talking about his decree, not his agency in the crushing. And then you should also look at the Septuagint rendering of this. And you know what? I have a Septuagint here in an Orthodox Bible. So I'm going to go ahead and flip there and read that to you before continuing. But my apologies again for not opening this up to the exact spot. And I have to remember, I think they order it quite differently in the Orthodox Bible than the Protestant Bible, which is typically the ESV that I read. Isaiah 53, as it reads in the Septuagint, because the Orthodox use the Septuagint part for their Old Testament. This is how verse 10 reads. It says, "The Lord wishes to cleanse him of his wound, and if you give an offering for sin, your soul shall see a long-lived seed." That actually comes out very differently from the Masoretic text. It's not very often that happens, but you should keep in mind that the Septuagint was the Greek transliteration or translation of the Hebrew, so there may have been a reason they chose that exact wording with the 72 or so people that came together to create that translation in the Greek. I would say Greek is actually a little bit more accessible to us as Westerners to try and translate it than the Hebrew, where you can lose a lot of things to idiom and things like that. But why would it say that? I think we shouldn't go with some more extreme PSA sounding ways of interpreting what the Masoretic says, which I don't even think, if we just use the Masoretic, that you completely land on PSA proper. So look again also at how Peter renders this passage as archetypal example or moral influence theory. That is something, when you get into Peter's writings, he will focus on that motif specifically. He does not go into talking about PSA types of things. So if verse 10 is used that way by Peter, the apostle, we should probably use it for that instrument and purpose as well. He is given as an offering for guilt there as well. So that goes with our offering to the Father part of the acrostic. And again, it's not saying that he is an offering to the Father by his death, but by his holistic life given to the Father, and that ultimately includes his death, which was the ultimate act of love in a perfect life. That life is given to the Father on behalf of humanity. Verse 11, it says that many are to be accounted righteous. I would think that is part of the Atonement restoration, part of our acrostic, which is recapitulation. Verse 12, he will live to divide the spoil with the strong, and I would say that is the glorious conqueror part of our acrostic, which is the Christus Victor model of atonement, or it also has the new creation motif in it from our acrostic. He bore the sin of many. Again, the scapegoat did that, part of our acrostic. To whom or what did Jesus pour out his soul? We need to ask that question. And I think that is answered with the ransom model and the descent to the dead part of our acrostic. He poured out his soul to death. I would say that death is being spoken of here as an entity. You could say, even though it's not like an individual, death could be looked at as like a corporate entity of sorts. There's some arguments to be made for that. So let's move on to our next portion of the discussion, which is questions that I would give to our PSA advocate friends. Question number 1, what was substituted in payment to God? His righteous life or his death? Is Yahweh the God of death or of the living? And if he is God of something, then the payment he receives is according to his affinity. So if he is receiving death, that would make it sound like he's the God of death. If he is receiving life, I would think of him as the God of life, which is how it describes him. Again, I'm answering the question. And that is, blood in Leviticus is given to God because the life of an animal is its blood. It should be showing a symbolism of life given to God, not a death being given to God by the blood. And those sacrifices, by the way, if you talk to people like Spencer Owen or any Orthodox person or any Jewish person that still maintains their Second Temple Judaism roots and that sort of thing, they will tell you that these sacrifices are communal meals primarily, and it is giving blood to God. It is not about the death. If you look at Leviticus, the word death doesn't appear nearly as much as blood or eating and those kinds of things, and it is very clear when you look at the number of times it comes up. So question number 2 I would ask our PSA friends is, if Jesus' death is a payment to the Father and Jesus gave his life a ransom for many, What does that immediately tell about what the Father is? So if we're giving him a ransom, what do you give a ransom to? You give a ransom to a captor. Okay, so I don't like where this is going. You see where I'm going with this? Question 3. What is forgiveness in everyday terms? Does it demand something be paid out to the last cent by or onto another party? Is that really what forgiveness is? Question 4. Were there any penal substitutes in the Old Testament? Any mention of bearing wrath? If you can find it, let me know. And again, I would encourage re-looking at how sacrifices worked in the Old Testament, and really giving a fair shake to people whose traditions have preserved that, more so than us kind of reading back our own interpretation into those events, as many of our modern writers have done. Question 5. Do fathers punish one child for the sins of another? Why or why not? I think we have a pretty good grasp as Christians. What is a good parent? What does a good father look like? And if this is the good Father, Father God, why do we not do these things with our children that we presume through a PSA lens that he does to Jesus for us in that context? It doesn't match up. So, question 6. Is it wrong when ancient Aztecs would sacrifice a willing virgin to a volcano to appease its wrath? Why or why not? This is actually something that I think was brought up by Greg Boyd. I don't agree with everything he says, but he has many good points on this discussion. That would be saying that PSA, or the Aztec volcano god sacrifice, is the correct intuition, but the wrong application, I think is how he might say that. I think it's pretty clear to us that that is the altogether wrong intuition. That is just not how this works. So that might be a more severe articulation PSA that would come close to fitting that model of wrath appeasement. If we're talking about wrath appeasement, that is volcano god language. I don't think we should walk around evangelizing, talking to people, oh, by the way, our God is like this angry volcano god in a way. That's not a good way to make a case for the God you're trying to evangelize about. So question 7 is, what are the real problems the Bible outright addresses in regard to sin and atonement? So does this go in the direction of forensics? Does this go in the direction of we need healing and cleansing, and we need to be changed, we need to be transformed, things that are ontological? I think that's actually the direction it goes. I don't think forensics is the main focus here. Question 8, does the Bible only show atonement as being made through death or shedding of blood, or are there other ways? What does this tell us about what offerings are? Again, we need to go back to the Old Testament to shed light on the New. And there is a visual that Spencer Owen made about the meaning of atonement, and I would like to link that at some point and show that to the public and give him fair attribution, but it's called The Means of Atonement, and it's a chart that he made, or kind of like a table, I would say, of information. So I asked the author of this book, Mr. Kevin George, if I have permission to share some of his thoughts. Some of them come from his book, and some of them are just things that I saw him articulate in a Facebook group somewhere. And yes, I was given permission to share these things, so I will share them now. These are Kevin's words, and he is fantastic at how he communicates this. So basic logic tells us that a complete payment cancels forgiveness. You cannot forgive a debt that has already been paid, and you do not need to pay a debt that has been forgiven. Forgiveness is granted because a debt has not been paid, not after the payment has been made. Make sure you catch that. Another point he made, forgiveness that can be bought or sold is not true forgiveness. If you think that you or a third party can purchase genuine forgiveness, you do not understand forgiveness. Another point is, we humans are able to forgive others when they sin against us. To claim that God cannot do a good thing that we can do is to make us more moral than God. PSA's infinite justice claim has God incapable of truly forgiving us without first getting a proxy payment by murder and blood. How can that be genuine forgiveness? I think he uses strong language there with the word murder. I maybe wouldn't do that, but otherwise I'm following him. Another point is, if someone says, I forgive you, you assume it is done right then, not secretly projecting it into a nebulous future where a payment will eventually be made by someone else. Secretly projecting the act of forgiving into the distant future would be considered deceptive. God is not a deceiver for forgiving people before Christ died. And another point, Jesus did not seem to think that he was going to make a payment to God for the sins of humanity. Even while on the cross, he did not speak as if he was making a payment when he said, Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they're doing. That's Luke 23, verse 34. Jesus did not say, Father, wait until I am finished paying for their sins, then you can forgive them. Point made. Verses to consider. Again, I mentioned some of my own here, some of Kevin's verses to consider. Proverbs 17:15, Romans 8:3, 1 John 3:8, Hebrews 2 verses 14 and 15, John 12 verse 3, Ezekiel 18, Deuteronomy 24 verse 16. Another point is the cup of wrath challenge verses, which would be Jeremiah 49 verse 12, Isaiah 51 verses 22 through 23, 2 Corinthians 2 verses 15 through 16. Those would be all great references to frame when we're talking about the cup of wrath, so we don't use it in the assuming ways that the PSA advocates do. This is great. He has 15 biblical reasons Jesus died listed in no particular order. So these are where scriptures actually tell us, why did Jesus die? Lays them right out. Number one, God wanted a faithful man to take Adam's place. Sounds like recapitulation to me, or adamant restoration. That's 1 Corinthians 15, verse 22, and verses 45 through 49, and also Philippians 2, verses 8 through 11. Number two, to reconcile us to God. 2 Corinthians 5, 17 through 21, Ephesians 2, verses 13 through 16, Romans 5, verses 6 through 10, Colossians 1, 19 through 22. Number three is to be an example, like our archetypal example, part of our acrostic or moral influence. It is shown in 1 Peter 2, verse 21, chapter 3, verse 18, and also Philippians chapter 2, verses 4 through 10. Fourth thing that Jesus died for was to stop sin. Matthew 26, verses 27 through 28, Mark 10, verse 45, Romans 6, verses 6 through 14, 1 Peter 2, verse 24, Galatians 1:4, 2:21, Titus 2:14, and Revelation 1:5. There's a lot to be said there. Point number 5 was to defeat the powers of evil, which is primarily from Colossians 2:15. That is like a very a favorite of mine. Of all the chapters in the Bible, Colossians 2 is up there. Point 6, to become the firstborn from the dead, Romans 8:29 and Colossians 1:18. Point 7, to supersede the Mosaic law with a blood covenant. That's in Ephesians 2, verses 13 through 17, and Galatians 3:13. Point 8, to express God's love. John 3:16, very popular verse. Romans 5:8. Point 9, and there's 15 total, by the way. Point 9, to set us right by faith. That's Galatians 2, verse 21, and 2 Corinthians 5:14 and 15. Point 10, to defeat death. Romans 6:9, 1 Corinthians 15:26, and 2 Timothy 1, verse 10. Point 11, to triumph over the power of sin. Romans 6, verses 10 and 11. Point 12, to crush the serpent's head. Genesis 3, verse 15. Point 13, to bring resurrection. 1 Corinthians 15, verse 20 through 22. Point 14, to draw others to himself. John 12, 32 through 33. I would say for that one, don't ever let a Calvinist tell you to read John 6:44 without also going there, and also read all around John 6:2. Their point does not stand even just within the chapter, and certainly doesn't stand when you get to John 12. And yes, they are correlating, despite they try to say that they do not. And point 15, to become our high priest. That is in Hebrews 10, verses 19 through 22. And Hebrews 10 is another one of those favorite chapters of mine. There's a lot of scathing language and warnings given to Christians there as well. So that is in Appendix A of this book that we just showed, entitled Atonement and Reconciliation. a search for the original meaning contrasted with penal substitutionary atonement. I will give some final thoughts because we've been spending a lot of time here, and if we ever do this in a conversational form with Tim, man, yeah, that would be a long video because we've already gone a long ways here. So final thoughts. In 2 Corinthians chapter 5, Christ was reconciling the world to himself in that he came in the flesh as human, then died and rose again to later become our ambassador to the Father. But the theme there is that we were raised with him to be a new creation in him that lives for him in his ministry of reconciliation. The theme is already recapitulation related by the time it gets to verse 21, which is a favorite of our PSA friends, so it would be a strange shift to make this a champion verse for PSA like all the advocates confidently proclaim it is. The theme was already recapitulation. You get to verse 21, then all of a sudden it just jackknifes to another point. No, I think we're still in that same thought. So second of my final thoughts is God being the one to punish Jesus has a backfiring effect. If you hold to the bait and switch model of atonement, or the fishhook, as it's properly better named, or the harrowing of Hades concept, that creates a backfiring effect, because in that the whole point is to indict the powers that condemned Jesus to death when he was innocent and divine. If God did this, God cannot indict those powers that condemned Jesus, since God did it himself, rather than simply handing him over and Christ willingly participating in the Father's wise plan. That's how I would say it is that. Here is, I cannot show you because this is not, I don't have a live screen share going on, but I have a chart made by Spencer Owen that I mentioned earlier called the Means of Atonement. And it's showing where atonement was made in the Old Testament with how, why, and the context explained. So just hitting at a few different means of atonement, there's a gift of money, mediation of an intercessor, mercy and truth, repentance, burning flower, elimination, right? Talking about cleansing, expiation, incense, holiness, contagion, death without blood, and time and or judgment. And he gives various passages for that. And the purposes that we see in order with that is to avert a plague, to pardon the people's transgressions, to pardon or blot out or wipe away sin, to turn from idolatry, to make reparation for sin or guilt, to remove sins from the community, to stop a plague, to cleanse or purify, to avenge blood guilt, and to declare an end to exile. And he gives context for each of those, but I will let you come across that to see the whole chart. Those are my final thoughts with everything. Thank you for your attention, and I hope this was a good follow-up to the discussion I had with Tim earlier on the acrostic of Snapdragon, which I am glad for that. I'm glad that as I prompted Perplexity AI, it came up with some very good things to say, and I pick and chose a little bit of the results it gave me and edited very slightly, and that's what we came up with. I think it does a better job than all the stuff that we went through in our critique today. So thank you again for listening, and hope you have a great rest of your day. And don't forget that we are hopefully going to keep going with this ministry called Faith Rewind Outreach, and there is going to be hopefully an active mailing list for that, and the Notion site will continue to have documents uploaded to it as I come across things that I think are important to share with you. So go check it out and have a great one, and to God be the glory. Thank you for listening. Have a great day.